The confrontation in Commander Williams's office was brief but decisive. When Jake mentioned the regulation about missing personnel, the commander's cold stare said everything. Alpha Team was officially listed as missing for 72 hours. No signal. No hope. Case closed. But something shifted in Jake's eyes at that moment. The commander didn't know that the scream Jake heard on that final radio transmission belonged to his best friend, Marcus Thompson. A scream that had been replaying in Jake's mind for 3 straight days, haunting his sleep and destroying his concentration during routine duties. Jake sat alone in the dimly lit communications room, surrounded by screens displaying Alpha Team's last known coordinates. The red X marked on the map indicated the Forbidden Zone, a place where no military personnel was authorized to enter, where soldiers disappeared without a trace, and where survival meant abandoning every rule of engagement taught in military academies. The room hummed with electronic equipment, banks of monitors showing satellite feeds, communication logs, and tactical displays that painted a picture of military operations across the entire region. But Jake's attention remained fixed on one specific set of coordinates, one particular radio frequency, and one transmission that had changed everything he thought he knew about military protocol. His trembling hand reached for the radio equipment, replaying the final transmission that had haunted him for 3 days straight. Marcus's voice cut through heavy static, desperate and pain-filled, reporting heavy fire and compromised coordinates. The professional military bearing was gone, replaced by raw fear and desperation that Jake had never heard in his friend's voice before. Then came the personal message that changed everything, an unfinished sentence meant for his wife Sarah, cut short by the abrupt silence that followed. The words hung in the air like a ghost, "Jake, if you hear this, tell Sarah that I..." Followed by gunfire, screaming, and then nothing but static that seemed to echo with the finality of death itself. In 12 years of military service, Jake had never faced such an impossible decision. Protocol demanded he accept Alpha Team's fate and move on. Standard procedure was clear: after 72 hours with no contact, missing personnel were classified as MIA, missing in action. The case would be filed, families would be notified, and life would continue as if 5 good soldiers hadn't just vanished into a black hole of military bureaucracy. But that voice in the static wasn't just any soldier. It belonged to Marcus Thompson, the man who had saved Jake's life more times than he could count. The man who had carried him through enemy territory when shrapnel wounds left him unable to walk. The man who had promised that they would always watch each other's backs, no matter what regulation or commanding officer said otherwise. Jake stood up slowly, his military career flashing before his eyes. 12 years of following orders, respecting the chain of command, and trusting the system that had trained him, promoted him, and given his life structure and meaning. All of it was about to end with a single decision that would brand him a deserter, a rogue operator, and a traitor to everything he had sworn to protect. The weight of regulations pressed against his conscience. Article 86 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice was clear about unauthorized absence. Article 87 covered missing movement. Article 99 dealt with misbehavior before the enemy. By the time Jake finished what he was planning, he would be guilty of violating at least a dozen military laws, each carrying the potential for court-martial, imprisonment, and dishonorable discharge. The weight of his decision pressed against Jake's chest as memories flooded his mind with cinematic clarity. 5 years earlier, during basic training at Fort Benning, Marcus had made him promise that if either of them ever went missing, the other would never give up. It seemed like a simple promise between young soldiers who believed they were invincible, who thought war was an adventure rather than a meat grinder that consumed lives with mechanical indifference. They had been competing in a survival exercise, both exhausted after 48 hours without sleep, when Marcus grabbed Jake's arm and made him swear the oath that now defined this moment. The promise was sealed with a handshake that seemed meaningless at the time but had grown into an unbreakable bond forged through shared danger, mutual dependence, and the kind of trust that only developed between soldiers who had seen each other at their worst and still chose to fight side by side. 3 years ago, that promise had saved Jake's life in ways that still gave him nightmares. Pinned down by enemy fire during a routine patrol that had turned into a massacre, Jake had accepted his fate. 3 members of his squad were already dead, ammunition was running low, and enemy forces were closing in from multiple directions. When backup seemed impossible and death felt inevitable, Marcus appeared like a ghost in the night, moving through enemy territory with the kind of precision that separated elite soldiers from ordinary infantry. For 2 miles through dangerous terrain, Marcus carried his wounded friend to the evacuation point, refusing to leave him behind despite enormous personal risk. Jake remembered every detail of that journey, the way Marcus's breathing became labored as exhaustion set in, the determined set of his jaw when enemy patrols passed dangerously close, the gentle way he repositioned Jake's weight when shrapnel wounds made movement excruciating. During the evacuation, while medics worked to stabilize Jake's condition, Marcus had whispered the same promise again. No matter what happened, no matter what regulations said, they would never abandon each other. Brotherhood transcended military hierarchy, personal safety, and even the possibility of death itself. Just last month, at a family barbecue that now seemed like a lifetime ago, Sarah had expressed her concerns about Marcus's upcoming mission. She had mentioned his nightmares, his unusual tension, and her feeling that something was different about this deployment. Jake had reassured her with confidence he now regretted, promising that both soldiers would return safely because that's what they always did. They watched each other's backs and came home together. Sarah had prepared Marcus's favorite meal, grilled steaks with her special marinade that took 2 days to prepare properly. Tommy had spent the afternoon showing off his baseball card collection, proudly displaying a rookie card that Marcus had helped him find at a sports memorabilia shop. The evening had been filled with laughter, conversation about Tommy's upcoming school year, and plans for a camping trip that would never happen. The framed photograph on Jake's desk captured that happier time: Marcus, Sarah, and 5-year-old Tommy at the barbecue, all smiles and laughter that seemed immune to the darkness that would soon consume their lives. Marcus had his arm around his wife while their son sat on his shoulders, making silly faces at the camera with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. It was a picture of a complete family, now shattered by whatever had happened in that forbidden zone. Jake opened his equipment locker with methodical precision, each item representing another step away from military protocol and deeper into unknown danger. Tactical vest rated for small arms fire, night vision goggles with 8 hours of battery life, ammunition for his service weapon plus extra magazines secured in quick-release pouches, emergency medical kit containing morphine, antibiotics, and field surgery supplies. GPS tracker with encrypted military satellites, climbing gear rated for alpine conditions, emergency rations calculated for 72 hours of sustained operations, water purification tablets tested in hostile environments, field communications equipment capable of reaching friendly forces within a 50-mile radius, and his service weapon, a weapon he had fired thousands of times in training but never hoped to use against human targets. As he gathered supplies, Jake calculated the risks with the analytical precision that 12 years of military service had drilled into his thinking. The Forbidden Zone earned its name through the disappearance of multiple reconnaissance teams over the past 2 years. Intelligence reports suggested heavy enemy presence, but the area remained officially unmonitored due to its extreme danger level and limited strategic value. Military personnel were strictly prohibited from entering without explicit authorization from the highest command levels, authorization that required congressional oversight for operations in that particular region. The political complications alone were enough to end careers, even before considering the tactical impossibility of solo operations in hostile territory against unknown enemy strength. Jake checked his weapon and ammunition with ritualistic attention to detail. Fully loaded, with extra magazines secured in his tactical vest according to standard operating procedures. He had no idea what he might encounter in enemy territory, but he refused to enter unprepared. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was potentially a one-way journey into a war zone where the rules of engagement meant nothing and survival depended entirely on training, instinct, and luck that had already failed Alpha Team. The gravity of his decision settled over him like a heavy blanket woven from consequences he couldn't fully imagine. By leaving base without authorization, Jake was ending his military career and potentially facing court-martial charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. By entering the Forbidden Zone alone, he was risking his life for what might already be a futile mission to recover bodies rather than rescue living soldiers. But the alternative, abandoning Marcus without even trying, filing paperwork that would classify him as missing in action, and watching Sarah receive a folded flag while her husband's fate remained unknown, was unthinkable. Some promises transcended regulations, and some friendships demanded sacrifices that couldn't be calculated in terms of career advancement or personal safety. At midnight, Jake slipped away from the base undetected, using knowledge gained from years of security operations to avoid patrol routes and surveillance systems that he had helped design. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was using his own security expertise to violate the very protocols he had spent years perfecting. The coordinates on his GPS showed Alpha Team's last known position deep in enemy territory, approximately 8 miles from the nearest friendly checkpoint through terrain that varied from dense forest to rocky mountain passes. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces controlled most of the region through a network of observation posts, patrol routes, and communication intercepts that made undetected movement nearly impossible. Jake left his vehicle at the final checkpoint and continued on foot, knowing that from this point forward, he was completely on his own. Each step took him further from safety and deeper into a region where American soldiers were considered high-value targets worth significant resources to capture or kill. The terrain grew progressively more challenging as dense forest gave way to rocky hills and steep ravines that channeled movement into predictable routes easily monitored by enemy forces. His military training guided him through the darkness as he moved silently between natural cover points, avoiding open areas where enemy spotters might detect his movement through thermal imaging or night vision equipment. The temperature dropped significantly as altitude increased, and Jake's breath became visible in the cold mountain air that carried sounds further than he preferred. Every shadow could conceal an enemy position. Every sound might indicate patrol activity or communication between hostile forces. Jake's senses operated at maximum alertness as he processed environmental information through filters developed during years of combat operations in similar terrain. After 2 hours of careful navigation that covered less than 3 miles of actual distance, lights appeared in the distance like distant stars against the black landscape. According to his coordinates, he was approaching the exact location where Alpha Team had made their final transmission. The area consisted of an abandoned industrial complex, its rusted machinery and crumbling buildings providing perfect concealment for enemy operations or the kind of ambush that had apparently destroyed an entire American military unit. Jake approached the complex with extreme caution, weapon ready and senses alert for any sign of hostile presence that might indicate active enemy operations. The silence was unsettling, no guards, no movement, no indication that this place had recently been the site of a major military engagement that had cost 5 American lives. Alpha Team's coordinates pointed directly to this location, but there was no evidence of American forces ever having been here. No spent ammunition casings, no equipment fragments, no signs of defensive positions or combat activity. Either the enemy had conducted an extremely thorough cleanup operation, or something else entirely had happened to Marcus and his team. Movement in nearby bushes triggered Jake's combat reflexes, muscle memory developed through years of training taking over as he swung his weapon toward potential threat sources. But instead of enemy combatants, he found himself face to face with Marcus Thompson. His best friend was alive, but barely recognizable after 3 days of survival in hostile territory. Marcus had lost at least 20 pounds, his uniform was torn and stained with blood both dried and fresh, and his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare that Jake recognized from soldiers who had seen too much death in too short a time. 3 days in hostile territory had transformed the confident soldier Jake remembered into a wounded, exhausted survivor clinging to life through sheer determination and the kind of stubborn refusal to die that characterized elite military personnel. Marcus lowered his weapon in shock, unable to believe that Jake had found him in this impossible place under circumstances that violated every regulation and tactical principle they had ever learned. The relief in his eyes was immediately replaced by concern and fear. This place was compromised, dangerous, and absolutely no location for an unauthorized rescue attempt that could result in 2 dead soldiers instead of 1 missing team. The reunion was brief and desperate, conducted in whispers while both men scanned their surroundings for signs of enemy activity. Marcus explained that Alpha Team had been completely eliminated in what was clearly an orchestrated ambush designed with specific knowledge of their mission parameters, routes, and tactical procedures. Wilson, Thompson, Garcia, Rodriguez, all dead, killed during the initial minutes of an attack that demonstrated intimate knowledge of American military tactics and equipment. Marcus had escaped during the initial assault but had been hiding in the ruins ever since, wounded and unable to call for help due to compromised communications and the certainty that enemy forces were monitoring all American military frequencies, inside an abandoned warehouse that provided concealment from enemy patrols. Marcus revealed the horrifying truth behind Alpha Team's destruction with evidence that painted a picture of betrayal reaching into the highest levels of American military command. The mission had been a setup from the beginning, orchestrated by someone with access to classified intelligence and detailed knowledge of their operational procedures. Enemy forces had known their exact route, timing, objectives, and even backup extraction points that were supposed to be known only to command staff and the team members themselves. The ambush had been positioned with surgical precision, eliminating escape routes and cutting off communication before Alpha Team realized they were walking into a trap designed specifically for their destruction. Marcus had spent 3 days gathering evidence while hiding from patrol sweeps that seemed to know exactly where to look for survivors. His damaged laptop contained intercepted communications that painted a clear picture of internal betrayal extending far beyond a single rogue operative. Someone within their own command structure had been feeding information to enemy forces for weeks, possibly months. The evidence was damning and comprehensive. Communication logs showed classified information being transmitted to hostile forces within hours of each mission planning session. Every detail of Alpha Team's operation had been compromised before they ever left base: routes, timing, equipment, personnel, and contingency plans that should have been accessible only to a small number of high-ranking officers with appropriate security clearances. Marcus suspected the identity of the traitor but needed more concrete proof before making accusations that could destroy careers and undermine military operations throughout the region. That's why he hadn't risked using radio communications to call for help. If the mole was monitoring their frequencies, any transmission would immediately reveal his location to enemy forces equipped with direction-finding equipment and rapid response capabilities. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Multiple military operations had been compromised, resulting in unnecessary casualties and strategic failures that had been attributed to enemy intelligence capabilities rather than internal sabotage. The money trail suggested foreign funding on a scale that indicated state-sponsored espionage rather than simple corruption or personal betrayal. As if responding to some unseen signal, the sound of heavy footsteps surrounded their position with military precision that suggested professional training and sophisticated coordination. Armed combatants had quietly encircled the building while Marcus explained the conspiracy, using tactics that demonstrated familiarity with American military procedures. Through a megaphone, an enemy commander demanded their surrender in accented English that suggested foreign training and possibly foreign command structure. The voice promised that no one else had to die if they complied immediately, but the surrounding positions indicated preparation for a prolonged assault if surrender was refused. Marcus realized the terrible truth that had doomed Alpha Team and now threatened both their lives. Jake's radio check when entering the Forbidden Zone had been monitored by the same communication intercepts that had provided enemy forces with real-time intelligence on troop movements and operational planning throughout the region. Enemy forces had been listening to American military frequencies with equipment sophisticated enough to decrypt standard military communications and track individual operators through their radio signatures. This capability explained how they had anticipated Alpha Team's every movement and positioned ambush forces with such devastating effectiveness. The building was completely surrounded by at least a dozen armed combatants positioning themselves for an assault designed to eliminate any possibility of escape or resistance. Through broken windows, Jake could see movement that indicated professional military training and equipment comparable to American Special Forces capabilities. Marcus led Jake toward a concealed exit he had discovered during his 3 days of hiding, but his injuries were severe enough to compromise any escape attempt. Shrapnel from the initial ambush had torn through his leg, and 3 days without proper medical attention had left him weak from blood loss and infection that was spreading despite his attempts at field treatment. Marcus made it clear that he wouldn't survive an escape attempt that required speed and agility he no longer possessed. His wounds were too severe, his condition too deteriorated by exposure and blood loss. But the evidence on his laptop had to reach headquarters before more soldiers died in similar ambushes orchestrated by the same internal betrayal that had destroyed Alpha Team. The approaching footsteps grew louder as enemy forces prepared to storm the building with overwhelming firepower designed to eliminate any possibility of resistance or escape. Time was running out, and both men understood that only one of them could survive to tell the story that needed to be told. Marcus made the decision for both of them, pressing his dog tags and the laptop into Jake's hands with the weight of brotherhood and sacrifice that transcended military protocol. The dog tags were warm from body heat and worn smooth by years of military service that had defined Marcus's adult life and given meaning to his existence beyond family and personal ambition. He asked Jake to break the promise they had made years earlier during basic training when they were young soldiers who thought they understood what sacrifice meant. Instead of never giving up on each other, Marcus needed Jake to leave him behind for reasons that extended far beyond personal loyalty or military brotherhood. For Sarah, who deserved to know that her husband had died with honor rather than disappearing into the bureaucratic void of missing in action reports. For Tommy, who needed to understand that his father had been a hero rather than simply another casualty of military operations gone wrong. For all the families who deserved to know the truth about what had happened in that forbidden zone and why their loved ones had been sent to die. Marcus removed his sidearm and handed Jake his remaining ammunition with instructions to find Sarah and Tommy when he returned to base. He would need to tell them that their husband and father had been thinking about them in his final moments, that he had died protecting information that could save other families from experiencing the same loss. Marcus asked Jake to explain that he had found a way to come home, even though his body would remain in that abandoned warehouse forever. The laptop contained evidence that could prevent other soldiers from walking into similar traps, making his death meaningful rather than just another casualty in a war that seemed to consume lives without purpose or progress.
Jake took the laptop and looked at Marcus one last time, memorizing details he would need to describe to Sarah and Tommy when he told them about their husband and father's final moments. His best friend, his brother-in-arms, was prepared to sacrifice everything so that the truth could survive and prevent future betrayals that threatened every American soldier operating in hostile territory. The weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable, but Jake understood that Marcus's death would be meaningless if the conspiracy remained hidden and other soldiers continued to die in ambushes orchestrated by internal betrayal. This wasn't just about friendship or military loyalty. It was about preventing a systematic pattern of sabotage that threatened military operations throughout the region. Jake climbed through a back window and disappeared into the darkness as gunfire erupted behind him with the intensity and duration that indicated sustained combat between professional forces. He didn't look back because he couldn't afford the emotional luxury of witnessing his friend's final battle. Marcus had given him a mission that was more important than grief, more crucial than the brotherhood that had defined their relationship. The journey back to base took 6 hours of careful movement through hostile territory using every survival skill he had ever learned. Jake stayed off roads, avoided settlements, and moved only during darkness while carrying evidence that could save countless lives if he survived long enough to deliver it to people who could act on the information. Every shadow might conceal enemy patrols searching for the surviving American soldier. Every sound could indicate pursuit by forces equipped with night vision and communication equipment. Jake's survival depended on remaining invisible while covering terrain that enemy forces knew better than he did. 3 days later, Jake stood in Commander Williams's office with Marcus's laptop on the desk between them like evidence in a murder trial that was about to begin. The information it contained was comprehensive and damning: communication logs, encrypted messages, and timing data that clearly showed internal betrayal at the highest levels of military command. Commander Williams listened to Jake's report with apparent concern and professional interest that seemed appropriate for a commanding officer learning about the loss of an entire military unit. He promised to initiate an internal investigation immediately and expressed appropriate sympathy for Alpha Team's losses with the kind of practiced sincerity that came naturally to career military officers. But Jake noticed something troubling in the commander's expression when he examined the laptop screen, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even fear, that suggested familiarity with information that should have been completely unknown to anyone not involved in the conspiracy. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained in interrogation techniques and behavioral analysis. When Jake mentioned concerns about the mole still being among them and potentially monitoring their current conversation, Commander Williams smiled coldly with an expression that transformed his entire demeanor. In that moment, Jake realized that the real betrayer was sitting directly in front of him, reviewing evidence of his own crimes with the casual confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. Commander Williams confirmed Jake's suspicions with casual admission that seemed almost relieved to finally acknowledge the truth. Alpha Team had been getting too close to information they shouldn't have accessed, information that threatened operations far more valuable than the lives of 5 American soldiers. Money had motivated the betrayal, enormous amounts of money that made war profitable for those who knew which side would ultimately win. Foreign intelligence services paid exceptionally well for information that could neutralize American military advantages and eliminate effective units before they could impact strategic objectives. Jake reached for the door handle, but armed guards entered the office before he could escape, moving with coordination that suggested they had been positioned outside during the entire conversation. Commander Williams apologized with mock sincerity, explaining that Jake would have to share Marcus's fate because the conspiracy had to remain hidden regardless of the cost in human lives. The stakes were too high and the money too significant to allow moral considerations or personal loyalty to interfere with operations that generated millions of dollars in foreign payments. Jake had become a liability that threatened not just Commander Williams but an entire network of corruption that reached into multiple levels of military command. Suddenly, the office lights went out with the precision of someone familiar with the building's electrical systems. In the darkness, gunshots rang out with professional accuracy that suggested military training and familiarity with close-quarters combat. When emergency lighting activated, the guards were down, and Sarah Thompson emerged from the shadows, armed and dangerous with equipment that indicated serious preparation. Sarah had been planning for this moment since Marcus contacted her before his final mission with instructions that seemed paranoid at the time but now revealed his understanding of the dangers he faced. He had warned her that if anything happened to him, she would need to watch Jake's back because someone in the command structure couldn't be trusted. Marcus had suspected that someone in their leadership was compromising operations and getting soldiers killed for personal gain. He had prepared his wife for the possibility that Jake might need protection when he returned with evidence, training her in basic tactical procedures and providing equipment that would allow her to intervene if necessary. As Sarah and Jake fled the building through routes she had scouted in advance, he told her about Marcus's final words and ultimate sacrifice with details that brought both tears and satisfaction. Marcus had kept his promise by finding a way to come home through Jake's survival and testimony, ensuring that his death would have meaning beyond personal loss. Sarah understood that her husband's death had prevented further betrayals that threatened every soldier under Commander Williams's command. The evidence Jake carried would expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond a single corrupt officer, potentially saving hundreds of lives by eliminating systematic sabotage of American military operations. Sarah had learned military tactics from her husband over the years, understanding that she might someday need to protect herself and Tommy in a world where Marcus's enemies could threaten his family. Marcus had always believed in being prepared for any possibility, and his foresight had saved Jake's life when the conspiracy finally revealed itself through Commander Williams's attempted murder. From a secure location that Sarah had prepared weeks earlier, Jake transmitted encrypted evidence to higher command levels using communication channels that bypassed all local control systems. The data from Marcus's laptop provided irrefutable proof of Commander Williams's betrayal and the systematic compromise of American military operations throughout the region. The investigation that followed Commander Williams's exposure revealed the full extent of his betrayal and the network of corruption that had cost dozens of American lives over the past 2 years. Multiple military operations had been compromised, resulting in unnecessary casualties and strategic failures that had been attributed to enemy capabilities rather than internal sabotage. The money trail led to foreign accounts containing millions of dollars and a network of corruption that reached beyond a single individual into military contractors, intelligence agencies, and political officials who had profited from American military failures. The scope of the betrayal required congressional investigation and resulted in military reforms designed to prevent similar conspiracies. Jake knelt beside Marcus's grave in Arlington National Cemetery, placing fresh flowers and his friend's dog tags on the simple headstone that would mark his sacrifice for future generations. The inscription read, "Marcus Thompson, loyal soldier, devoted husband, true friend," words that captured the essence of a man who had died to protect others. In the distance, Sarah and Tommy approached with their own flowers, a family forever changed but united by love and the knowledge that Marcus's sacrifice had prevented further tragedies. Tommy had grown taller in the months since his father's death, but he still carried himself with the quiet dignity that Marcus had tried to instill through example rather than instruction. Sarah thanked Jake for bringing Marcus home, but Jake understood that Marcus had brought himself home through the evidence that exposed the conspiracy and the friendship that had motivated Jake's unauthorized rescue mission. The last signal wasn't the end of Marcus's story, it was the beginning of justice for him and every soldier who had died because of Commander Williams's betrayal. Sometimes friendship proves stronger than military orders and personal safety. Sometimes the real enemy stands closer than anyone imagines, wearing the same uniform and speaking the same oath of service. And sometimes the last signal becomes the most important message of an entire lifetime, carrying truth across impossible distances and ensuring that sacrifice leads to justice rather than meaningless loss. The promise they had made during basic training had been kept, not through mutual survival but through mutual sacrifice that transcended death itself. Marcus had come home through Jake's testimony, and Jake had honored his friend through the courage to risk everything for truth and justice.
And that's Marcus Thompson's last signal, a transmission that saved countless lives. Here at Last Signal Stories, every soldier's final message deserves to be heard. If this story moved you, hit subscribe for more military stories. Drop a comment below, what would you have done in Jake's situation? Until next time, stay tuned for the signal.